Welcome to the Townbulders podcast. I'm your host, Levi Wentz. Townbulders is produced by the National Townbuilders Association, implementers of the new urbanism. This episode is brought to you by James Hardie, what the best are made of. James Hardie is America's #1 brand of siding and is a surefire way to elevate your house. Their products are elegant, durable, and they have a variety of styles to fit exactly what you're looking for. To see more and find a local supplier, visit jameshardie.com. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Season 4 of the Townbuilders podcast. I'm very excited for this season as we have a bunch of amazing guests lined up for you. And I couldn't think of a better way to kick things off than with Jan Sramek, who is the CEO and founder of the California Forever project. California Forever is one of the most ambitious developments afoot in the United States today. The plan is to build a new walkable city just to the northeast of San Francisco from scratch for more than 400,000 residents. The city will be supported with jobs coming from the Foundry, a 2,000-acre manufacturing park bringing world-class advanced manufacturing back to the United States, and the shipyard, which sits in a deep-sea channel of the Sacramento River and would be by far and away the largest shipyard in America. So at a moment when so many people and businesses are leaving California, Jan is making the opposite bet that California can once again lead as a beacon of American innovation, of dreaming big, and that the next great American city will be born in Solano County. Jan argues that we need to think big if we actually want to start addressing these issues seriously. And he believes the land assembled that sits halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento is the single best place to build a new city in the United States. A project of this size has drawn no shortage of criticism. And Jan's list of Silicon Valley investors has led people to believe he is building a futuristic tech utopia. But instead, what Jan is proposing draws its inspirations from the great cities and neighborhoods of America's past, like Charleston, Savannah, the West Village in New York, or Lincoln Park in Chicago. In our conversation, we get into how Jan raised nearly $1 billion and assembled 70,000 acres over the course of 7 years. We discuss his inspiration for development and how he is navigating California's regulatory environment and what phase 1 of building a city from scratch actually looks like on the ground. Jan is deeply optimistic and makes a genuine case that the best chapter of California's story has yet to be written. I think you're going to like this one. So thank you for listening and welcome to Season 4 of Townbuilders. Jan, I think this is the first time having a city builder on the Townbuilders podcast. So I'm a little unsure of how it's going to go, how we're going to make this work, but, we'll give it our shot. And, I couldn't be more excited to be talking with you today. So thank you for coming on.
Same here. Excited for this conversation.
So from the set, I was hoping you can give me a little backstory of how the different turns and experiences in life led you to this point of having an idea to build a massive new city from scratch.
I would say there were kind of two different strands that combined to lead me here. So I've been working on this for 10 years now. I started the company in 2016. I had the idea in 2016. I started the company in 2017. So it's been almost a decade. I would say one strand was I grew up in Central Europe after the wall came down. I was born in 87, wall came down in 89. And so I grew up with this idea of California as this deeply optimistic place that could do anything and that could build anything. And then I finally got here in 2013 after wanting to come my whole life. And I discovered that we could build anything in the digital world, but building stuff in the physical world was a different ballgame. And I found that profoundly sad. And initially it was just an interest. And then over time, I decided I wanted to work on it. And that was, how do we build more of everything, of factories and offices and housing and infrastructure? And then the second component on the walkability front is I grew up in a very small village of 1,000 people that had decent urbanism, not excellent, but decent urbanism. But it was a small village. And so getting anywhere to see my friends, to go to school, you had to basically take either a car or a public transport. At least the public transport was good. And that gave me appreciation, I think, at a very small scale for the value of good urbanism and then also the cost of being disconnected from the neighboring area. And then I had this very intense period before coming to California of living in some of the most walkable and livable places in the world. And so I lived for 10 years in the Old York, in the Old Cambridge, in London, and in Zurich, and in Manhattan. And so for 10 years, it wasn't that I just didn't own a car. I physically didn't drive a car.
What was taking you around to those different places?
I got a scholarship to go to high school in the UK for a year, and then I ended up staying, and I got a scholarship to go to college. So I stayed, and then I worked there. Yeah, so for 10 years, I basically barely used the car. For the last 3 years before coming to California in Zurich, I don't think I set foot in a car once in 3 years in Zurich, believe it or not. I think we rented a van to go to IKEA and buy some furniture. But that was literally the only time that I did it. And I mean, we went skiing and we took skis and we took a train and all of that. And so it was just this very intense contrast between not driving for 10 years and then getting catapulted into the Bay Area and finding it very odd how small was the proportion of the housing stock that was walkable. And I think particularly kind of the last piece of it is basically portions of San Francisco, portions of Berkeley, small portion of Oakland. And what that meant is those were basically the most expensive neighborhoods in all of the Bay Area because so many people wanted to live in them and we had so few of them, which meant that basically only the wealthiest people could afford them, which seemed wrong, I think.
Right. It's just a basic supply issue. If we're not building walkable places, so they just become valuable.
Exactly. And I think that's what you've seen over the last 10 years, right? I mean, San Francisco has gone through its fair share of issues with COVID and homelessness and job losses and so on. And despite that, it remains one of the most expensive cities in America. And I think that's in no small part due to the fact that it is the only truly walkable city on the West Coast at that scale. And so there's a number of people, particularly people who are creative and people who work in a bunch of the domains that are driving innovation in the Bay Area, who will put up with homelessness, who will put up with a school system that doesn't work because they care about it so much. And I think that's a huge demand signal of just how much demand there is for walkable urbanism on the West Coast in particular.
So why California then? You have this company named California Forever, which sort of speaks to it. But you started on the top there talking about how Silicon Valley, it's really good with software, but it's been really poor at hardware and building things. I'd love to explore that idea a little bit, why you think that is. But certainly from an outside perspective on California, it's rather negative. See in the news, mass exodus of people and businesses leaving to Florida and Texas. And it seems like a rather countercultural move to be reinvesting in the future of California while so many others seem to be disinvesting. And that's not to mention either the sort of regulatory process that has really kept the state from effectively growing its cities for decades now. And so I'm actually originally from California, now living in Idaho, and with 3-week permitting timelines. I can't imagine trying to build something in California where we still see a year after the Palisades fire, no more than a dozen homes have gotten permits and have started to rebuild. So why California?
I mean, it's a little bit in the name, but I think California, despite its many failings, I think is a place that is worth fighting for. And so despite a lot of the issues that you see in California with permitting and CEQA and inability to get stuff built and energy costs, it still is the innovation capital of the United States. A lot of the culture, a lot of the, obviously, software, AI, robotics, all of these fields are still being built and driven out of California. And I think one response to the issues of California is to kind of say, well, it's not going to get better and we should just give up on the state. But I think it's important that there's a combination. And I think some people leaving the state and saying we're going to go build it in Texas or in Florida or in Idaho is a really good thing, because I think you need that market signal of people are going to move if you don't make it easy enough to do business. But I think it's also important to recognize that California is 12% of the US by population. It's much more than that by GDP. It's much more than that by its importance to national security and manufacturing. And so I think it's worth fighting for. And I think what you've seen in the last few years is a pull towards, I would say, pragmatic, centrist policies in California. And that was kind of my bet when I started the company in 2017. I felt that the situation would get worse over time. Home prices would probably increase. But eventually, once people have seen enough of their kids or their family or their friends leave the state and go somewhere else, or their kids not be able to afford to live in the community where they grew up in, you would have a reaction. And basically, we would say, hey, we've passed a lot of really well-intentioned policies, but when you layer them on top of each other, they just don't work anymore, and we need to rethink it. And I think that's basically what's happened in the last 2.5 years in California. I mean, home prices doubled almost since I started the company. But then in the last 2 years, you've seen, for example, the most aggressive reform of the California Environmental Quality Act in 50 years that the governor passed. And people like Buffy Wicks passed, Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks, just last year, when they basically rolled it back for all infill housing. And so I think that the future of California is going to be determined in the next few years. And we hope to be one of the forces that shows that you can still do stuff here.
Right. And it's, of course, a really big ship to turn, but you're maybe having some of these conversations. Do you feel like that the interstate competition of now different states are trying to recruit businesses, trying to recruit people to move to their states? Do you see California waking up at all to that of, hey, maybe we should be thinking about things differently? Is that the feeling on the ground?
Yeah, I think that's definitely begun to happen. And I think that's actually healthy. I mean, in some sense, I think for a long time, America was defined by this kind of booster competition between different cities and different states. And you read the histories of the 19th and 20th century, and it was like, we just built this new office building in downtown and it's 25 stories tall. And then the state or the city next door would build one that's 26 stories tall, and they would announce that they just built a new freeway or a new railroad or a new bridge. And honestly, I think that's much more the relationship that we should have between states than arguing over social issues, which people can kind of self-select where they want to live and what kind of policies they want to adopt in that regard. But I think it would be a lot healthier if Texas and California were arguing not over social issues, but over, well, who built the most housing, who built the most energy, who has the biggest number of manufacturing jobs, who can build the most planes and ships and so on. And I'm hopeful that we are moving more in that direction, which would be really good for the country overall.
Yeah, well, and I think your whole plan is based off that, right? Of you're casting a new vision for how Americans can live. And you're putting that out there. You're betting on that's going to attract a certain number of people to move from other cities and other states to come to California forever.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we are casting a new vision for how people can live, which is very much, in some sense, a very old vision for how people can live, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at the urbanism that we propose, it's very similar to a lot of the late 19th, early 20th century neighborhoods that have been built all over America, particularly on the East Coast, places like Charleston or Savannah or West Village or Brooklyn or Chicago or the old neighborhoods in San Francisco and Santa Monica. And so I think it's taking a very old vision of urbanism and then updating it, and we have some innovative ideas in there. And then I think combining it with, again, a very old American idea of how do you build industry and manufacturing and ships, which is something that we used to be really, really good at as a country. And again, we've kind of forgotten. So I think on both the manufacturing and the residential piece of what we're doing, in some sense, it's more like going back to go forward than kind of trying to create a new vision.
I want to dig into that a bit more. First, let's just go back to, you have the idea. The first step in development is site analysis. So how did you come up with Solano County? How did you identify the piece of land that you're on as this is the piece of land that we need to go after?
I mean, there's a bit of a backstory here. So I get to California in about 2013. And as I mentioned, I was just really fascinated by this observation that we couldn't really build much of anything. And so for 2 years, this was just an interest which became an obsession. And I went on this deep dive of history of California, history of land use in California, history of cities and urbanism and manufacturing and all of these things. And then I actually spent about a year working on how do we build radically more through infill, and looked at ideas like, can you take a bunch of the real estate in Silicon Valley that has a lot of parking around it and repurpose it and build more, whether it's offices or residential there. And the conclusion of that process at the end of the year was I was even more depressed than at the beginning, because it was very clear that there was no way that you couldn't fix all of the issues that way. I mean, it would be a major part of the solution, and infill remains the kind of dominant contributor to doing this in California. But if you looked at the 3 million homes that we were missing, and then also if you looked at we needed to build new factories, you can't build a new factory in an infill location. Like, there's just not enough brownfield sites at that scale. And so at the end of that period, I thought, well, either the state can't grow anymore, or we're going to have to build some new cities, and we're going to have to basically build better greenfield, either new cities or kind of traditional greenfield continuous expansion. And I felt that if you were operating at the scale of a city, you could do a much better job on both the urbanism and the manufacturing and the jobs, because so many of the problems get easier as you get scale. Some of them get harder, but many of them get easier. Ironically, within seconds of the thought of building a new city at the edge of the Bay Area, I thought we should do that in Solano County. And the reason why I thought that is kind of through just sheer good fortune. I drove through that site a few months before then to go fishing on the California Delta in Rio Vista in the spring of 2016. And so I remember driving through this huge area, this expansive area that wasn't row crops, it wasn't park, it wasn't hiking, it wasn't habitat. It was this kind of relatively low grade grazing land that seemed like the perfect place to build. And then at the same time, I remembered conversations that I had with a fishing guide on the river who told me that his wife worked in Mountain View, which is 2 hours each way daily commute. And he told me he had a 2-year-old son, and I said, "Well, how does that work?" And he said, "Oh, it's fine. She leaves at 3:30 in the morning and to beat the traffic, and then she comes back home after lunch." And he said, "Well, then I leave later and I take care of the kids in the morning." And I said, "So when do you see your wife?" And he says, "Well, I see her on the weekends. It's perfectly fine." And I said, "This is completely insane. Like this is the craziest thing that I've heard in a long time." And it turns out this was pretty common because for some reason in this part of California, we developed a land use pattern where we have the jobs between San Francisco and San Jose and then up in Sacramento. And then in between them, in the middle of that area, which is where we're building, you basically have a lot of homes and not very many jobs. And so you had this massive open space, and it seemed like you could put a big city there, and then you could solve a bunch of people's problems, including the commuting problem. And so it was kind of the initial intuition, which was complete fluke because I went fishing and I drove through it. I'd like to say that I had a long spreadsheet and I ran careful site selection to arrive at the location, but I didn't. What I did do after that is, after I thought of that location and after I validated it, and actually the more work I did on it, the better it seemed as a location, I did then go and look at, well, is this really the best place to do it in California? And it turns out that when I did do that spreadsheet analysis and I ran all of that work, it is by far the best place, probably not just in California, but in the entire United States, to build something like this, certainly of this scale. And happy to go into why that's the case.
Yeah, talk me through the Excel sheet. What did you find that was special about this site?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll put up a slide and just show people where this site is for those who are watching it as the video.
And we'll try to talk people through for those of you that are just listening to audio.
100%. So what we're looking at is the map of Northern California from roughly San Jose all the way to Sacramento. So it's a region that has about 12 million people who live here. So if this was a state, it would be the 7th largest state in America. And Solano County is roughly in the middle of it, halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento, about an hour from each, and about a half an hour east of Napa. What makes this area, I think, the best place to build a new city in the United States is, number one, its proximity to 2 major metro areas that have a lot of demand for housing, industry, all kinds of space. And so it helps if you are not just at the edge of one metro area, but at the edge of 2 different ones. So as I mentioned, we are kind of in between 2 major metro areas in the heart of this triangular region that has about 12 million people who live there. It's a place where we've been able to assemble a very large parcel. So we own about nearly 70,000 acres at this point. So that's about 2.5 times the size of San Francisco, about 5 times the size of Manhattan, 50% bigger than Washington, D.C. So it really allows us to operate at a scale that we haven't done in America in a long time. And then the actual characteristics of the site. Number one, it's the lowest quality agricultural soil within 200 miles, according to the official documents at the state level. It is also the least ecologically valuable place within 200 miles. So if you look at official county and state documents, it literally says that big parts of the land where the city is going literally have, in their words, 0 things worth preserving in them. And so if we're going to do any greenfield development anywhere, where would you want to do it? You want to do it in the least agriculturally valuable land, least ecologically valuable land. It is all between basically 25, where the city is going, it's between 25 and 160 feet above sea level. So it's a very resilient location from a flooding and sea level rise perspective. It doesn't have any forests around it. It's either grasslands or marsh or water. And so from a fire risk perspective, it's very easy to manage. There isn't a single earthquake fault line that runs through the entirety of the 70,000 acres. And it is close to transportation. It's a few miles from the interstate that goes from San Francisco to Sacramento. There's even an old rail line that goes through the middle of the city that isn't used right now, but maybe could be used eventually. Backbone California infrastructure goes through the middle of the site, like major gas transmission lines, power transmission lines, there's gas speakers on the side, fiber optics. So it's this really interesting place that's in the middle of the region, has a lot of infrastructure where if Northern California is going to build at scale anything, whether it's manufacturing or shipbuilding or housing, this is exactly where we should be building. So the next question you might ask yourself is, well, if it's such a good place to build, why hasn't the city been built there before? And the great irony, and one of the things that actually gave me the confidence to work on this, is that people have plans to build cities there for 67 years at this point. There is a 1958 study by the Federal Commerce Department and the Army Corps of Engineers called The Future Development of the San Francisco Bay Area. And in it, they literally mapped development in the 9-county Bay Area region for 60 years, all the way until 2020. And they predicted that between 2010 and 2020, we would build a new city, exactly where we're building a new city. And so in some sense, we're taking a very old idea and dusting it off and breathing new life into it. Remarkably, they even got the timing correct. And basically what they said is, when we run out of space to build in the inner baying, we'll need to go somewhere a little bit further out. And this is going to be a good place to build exactly for the reasons that I just listed.
Townbulders is brought to you by Brett Jones, PA. Brett is a practicing land use lawyer in Florida, and as a patron and advocate for new urbanism, he leverages his background in corporate law and personal development experience to help landowners and developers get entitlements and cut through red tape to build human-centric, walkable neighborhoods. Visit brettjonespa.com to find out more. Okay, so I'm curious to go back to the idea of building a new city and that has good urbanism and solve some of the housing crisis that was maybe initial thorn in your side that got you thinking about this. At what point did sort of the jobs and the economic questions of the vitality of a city come in? Because you've really had these great opportunities that you announced with the foundry and the shipyard that are honestly going to solve massive issues for the U.S. if they are able to be built. But how central was the idea of generating jobs to your early pitch of building the new city? Or was the development of partnerships like this something that sort of grew organically over time? Maybe first you can explain both the foundry and the shipyard, and then the strategy of how you got here, whether it was organic or sort of sought out from the beginning.
Yeah, I can maybe start with the strategy. So from the beginning, the strategy was you could make this work just by building a great walkable place where people want to live and they could get jobs in the rest of the region. But that was always the kind of backup strategy. My conviction from day one was that we could get jobs there. And the idea was, number one, if you kind of looked around the corner a little bit in 2017, you could begin to see manufacturing come back to the US. There was a new generation of companies getting founded in Silicon Valley to do manufacturing. People were beginning to talk about the dependency on China. So there was that. There was also just the idea of, at the time, companies from Silicon Valley started putting jobs in other parts of the US. And when you spoke to them, they didn't want to do it. They understood the value of having company culture in the same place, or having a place where people could come together for a meeting during the middle of the day, even if they were physically not in the same offices. And so the idea was always, if you have a place that can build a great set of neighborhoods to live in where people can buy a home, and it's an hour and a half away from Silicon Valley, and then you can deliver homes at costs that are comparable to a place like Austin, then a lot of companies would rather put their office or their manufacturing facility in Solano than putting it in Texas. Because it's very seductive to say, oh, it's just a 3.5-hour flight from San Francisco to Austin. But it's not. Because it's an hour to get to the airport, it's an hour and a half at the airport and TSA, and then the plane is late, then you get out, and then you have to go through the airport and get in an Uber and go to your final destination. So going from California to Texas or to Ohio or anywhere else is a 3-day trip. And if you're running a company, that just means inevitably that you might do that quarterly. But for most of your employees, that's not something they can do every month or even every quarter. And so there's a lot of benefits to co-locating all of these things together, whether that's office jobs or whether it's manufacturing jobs. it was there from the beginning. Certainly, I think it's been supercharged by how quickly America has moved towards onshoring and manufacturing and shipbuilding. And then the way that we are specifically doing that, maybe I can show another slide. So if we look at the land use map now, there's basically three main components to what we're building. You mentioned two of them already. And so the land that we own is shown in the green hashings. The foundry is a manufacturing park. You would build things like components here. You could build drones. You could build battery systems. You could build built environment systems. You could do modular housing, any of those innovations. Aerospace and defense. We obviously have the shipyard location, which is the last, or at least the largest remaining maritime reservation to do shipbuilding in the US. It's about 6.5 miles of waterfront. It's about 15 times bigger than the second biggest shipyard in America. And then Solano Living is basically the downtown and the mixed-use neighborhoods. So that's space for about 170,000 new homes.
So how did you come up? I'm curious here on the scale. So 17,500 acres. You've accumulated close to 70,000 acres. So what modern cities might that 17,500 acres compare to, and why limit it to that size when you have 70,000 acres out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, one of the appeals of walkable urbanism or new urbanism has always been that you can build higher quality neighborhoods that people actually prefer and that take less space. And then you can keep more of the land as open space, whether it's for agriculture or recreation or parks or other uses. And then in terms of the size of the city, with the revised plan, it's about 15,000 acres. The developable portion of it is about 10,000 acres. 5,000 acres are green belts around the city, and then a big park in the middle, and then a series of parks throughout the city. That's almost exactly half the size geographically and half the population of San Francisco. So the best way to think about it, it's about half the size of San Francisco. I think the big difference is San Francisco has a very uneven density. You have the downtown where you have massive residential 50-story condo towers all the way down to the west side, which is basically row homes and even just single family homes. We'll probably end up having a much more of an even density between 3 and 8 stories throughout the city. But in terms of size, that's probably the right comparison.
So throughout the entire city, you expect that to be the transect of different neighborhoods and densities. You expect to really remain the same between that 3 and 8, and you're not really, don't plan to have a single family detached section of the city.
Yeah, I mean, we might have narrow lot single family, which, I mean, obviously there's a kind of continuum between narrow lot single family and row homes. And it's how close do you put it together? And do you kind of cover up the gap between them or not? And so we might have some of those things like you see. And if you look at the single family that you see in places like Backtown in Chicago, where I lived for a while, it's a good example of feels very row homey, but they are technically single family homes. We'll have a little bit of a transect in that the downtown is designed to have higher intensity. You can go to 8 stories. The big offices, apartment buildings are meant to go into the downtown. In what we call the mixed-use neighborhoods, you can go to 5 stories. So there's going to be a little bit of a transect, but I would expect it's going to be relatively narrow in range compared to some cities where you go from very rural and kind of large lot single family all the way to 20-story or 50-story buildings in the heart of the city.
I think that scale of 5 to 8 stories is going to feel very comfortable across an urban setting. What about along the edge there? Is there going to be a hard urban edge before you get to the rural zone, or how would that look and feel?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a good moment to look at a plan here. So this is the land use diagram for the city. So you can see the Solano Foundry here in blue. We have a downtown in the middle. It's almost exactly a square mile. It's actually the highest point on the property as well. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting urban design decision where kind of from the downtown, you see the whole city, and from the whole city, you can see the downtown. This purple area is what we're calling maker manufacturing. That's trying to replicate places like Fulton Market in Chicago or Meatpacking in New York or R Street in Sacramento, these kind of old warehouse districts of the downtown, which then become small-scale manufacturing, arts, entertainment, lofts, nightlife. And then the rest of it is mixed-use neighborhoods. You can see they are centered around these pink or red retail streets in the heart of each of the neighborhoods. In terms of the edge, you can see here the the green belts. And so it's quite a sharp edge. There's basically a boulevard that runs alongside, for example, this northern edge that we call the Northern Boulevard. And you can see the Central Park that kind of fans out into that space and then actually lines the edge of these neighborhoods. And then there's a boulevard, and beyond that, it's all agriculture and open space. And so both myself and Gabe Metcalf, who runs planning, are quite strong believers that at least in this particular location for this particular project, the hard edge is going to be a defining feature of it. And it's something that's given, I think, the local community a sense of security as well, where one of the concerns with this is, well, what if this is the thing that you're designing and then it just kind of sprawls out beyond that?
Right.
And you can see here that we really designed it in a way where we have this hard edge. And for example, the transportation infrastructure is not really set up to support it sprawling out. And it's clearly separated by the park from the agricultural lands behind it. And so I think that's going to create a really interesting edge there.
Right. And for people listening here, there's sort of this like river of a green belt running directly through the middle of the site plan there. What is the width of that green belt that interrupts the urban environment there?
Yeah, so sorry, that's the Central Park. So the light green here are the green belts. This is the Central Park to the downtown, but it connects to the green belts. And then the Central Park is generally programmed where the most active uses in it are next to the downtown. And then as it kind of gets further out to the edge of the city and eventually out, it changes more from active programming to much more passive uses. So the transition between that and the greenbelt is quite soft and natural. The park is about 1,200 acres. So it's about the size, it's bigger than Central Park. It's bigger than Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. The width of it is, depending on where you are, it is it's generally about a third of a mile. In the widest place, it's probably about 0.6 of a mile. It's a pretty good sized park.
Friends, great towns don't happen by accident. The places that we remember, the ones that people love for generations, are built with intention, craft, and a deep understanding of how people actually live. New towns need a strong vision from day one, but also the flexibility to evolve as families grow, lifestyles and businesses change, and communities mature over time. Townwright Studio brings that level of craft and long-term thinking to every project they touch. From master planning and entitlements, town architecture, renderings, and illustrations that help bring that vision to life. If this podcast has inspired you to think about building places worth caring about, we encourage you to reach out to Townwright Studio and explore opportunities to partner. Learn more at townwrightstudio.com. That's TOWNWRIGHTSTUDIO.com. Now back to the show. You've brought up Chicago and New York and some of these American cities. Are these some of your inspiration for the design of the urban setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a smaller scale of what this might feel like in the early days, I would say the inspirations are places like Savannah or Charleston. And then as it matures and becomes bigger, they would be more places like the West Village or Lincoln Park or back down in Chicago or the Marina or Noe Valley in San Francisco. So it's these 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century neighborhoods, very traditional American urban grid, basically missing middle. As we've now given it a new name in the urbanism cycles, missing middle. But all it basically means is these old school neighborhoods.
Okay, so take us through the last 10 years of this journey. Where are you at now, and what's the pathway for you now to breaking ground on the plan?
It was a long time to put together the land. So I spent about 8 years assembling the land, 7 years assembling the land. And the view was basically, yes, that would take a long time, but if you could put together a large holding, then you could really think at a scale that we haven't been able to think at in America in a long time.
Starting to get started.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the pitch was basically building a new city is very risky and it takes a long time. But if you have patient capital and you're willing to invest for 20 or 30 years, these things can be great investments over a long period of time. And they can become great investments over the period of time if you execute it well and if you take the long-term view. But you have to get the capital that is willing to do that. The first time that I tried to raise money for it, nobody would invest, which was, by the way, the same pitch that I used the second time when I went to raise money. Everyone thought, oh, this makes sense, but it's too crazy, and what do you know about building cities? And there must be something that you haven't thought about. But I was so convinced that this would work because prior to raising money, I basically spent 9 months trying to convince myself it was a bad idea. So after I had the idea of doing this, I then quickly went back and forth between this is a great idea and this is a terrible idea. And there must be something that I'm missing. And so then I set out to prove that it was a bad idea. And I looked at all of the issues that you could expect: water, transportation, politics, soils, species, whatever it is. And I couldn't find the fatal flaw. Went out to raise money, nobody would invest. But because I just spent 9 months convincing myself that it was a bad idea and I couldn't do it, I believed in it so much that I basically took everything I had and all of my savings, and I borrowed a irresponsible amount of money personally. And I used that to tie up the initial few pieces of land and then go to a bunch of experts and say, here is my theory of why there's plenty of water that I've acquired through reading of X books and Google, and you've been doing it your whole life. Give me a feasibility analysis. And then I did similar things for transportation and land use and other kind of key issues. And then once I had that kind of external validation that what I was saying wasn't just crazy, I was able to raise the first $10 million. But it also was very incremental. I mean, we raised just over $1 billion now, but it was 10 million, and then it was 5 million. It was another 5 million, then it was 80. And so it was a very gradual process over time.
Okay, so current plans towards breaking ground.
Yeah, so take your step back to kind of set the context. So 7 years to assemble it, and then this became public about 2 years ago. And what we did initially is we proposed to build this as what's called an unincorporated community in California. What that means is basically it is a new community that is governed by the county board of supervisors, which can decide eventually to become a city if the citizens want. But in the beginning, it's in the county. And that's because we didn't have any of the cities in Solano saying we would like to do it ourselves. So we thought, okay, we need to do a new community. In Solano County, they have a measure in place that says if you want to do this, you need to go to the ballot and get an approval of the voters. And so we went to the ballot. And then obviously it was very controversial when we announced it. If you introduce something of this scale, right, you can imagine the reaction of that. What was very interesting during that process is as we refined the plans and as we built trust, the feedback that we've heard from most people was, we like the plan, we like the land use plan, we like the location, but we would prefer if you did it as part of an existing city. Instead of trying to win this vote and do this divisive thing in the community, why can't you guys just do it as an extension of existing city?
That's what the community members said.
Yeah, exactly. That's what elected officials said. That's what community members said. That's what some of the members of the public said. And we said, look, if there's a city here that wants to do it, we would love to. We don't care whether this goes in the county, whether this goes in a city. We just want to build a great place, great urbanism, and bring jobs here. And so eventually 2 of the cities came forward and invited us in for an annexation. There's a city on the east side called Rio Vista. There's a city on the west side called Susun. And that's the process we've been working through for the last year. The majority of the project right now is going into the city of Susun as what's now called the Susun expansion plan. There's a long history of places that were pretty small places that had a major expansion, that they became big cities. I mean, Manhattan was this tiny place south of Houston Street that did the commissioner's plan of 1811, and that created Manhattan. And places like Barcelona were the old Gothic Quarter, and then they built Eixample and the famous kind of octagonal blocks that you know in Barcelona. And so this is following in those footsteps a little bit. And so we've been working on that for the last year. And then the city is right now in the process of doing the environmental work. They put out what's called in California a notice of preparation at the end of last year. And there should be a draft environmental impact report document coming out this year, which I understand is likely to be the longest environmental impact report in the history of California, or close to it. 20,000 pages of paperwork studying everything and anything about the project. But that should be coming out this year, and then the city will be voting on it after that.
Okay.
After the city approves it, it goes to a county commission, effectively, which is the final approval body.
Of course, you're not there yet, but talk us through, what does phase 1 of building a city actually look like? What sort of infrastructure do you need? What comes first? You have jobs, you have houses, there's commercial and retail. So where do you start, and how do those things sort of stack on each other year after year?
So you've got the foundry and the shipyard piece, which kind of run on a separate track, where they might break ground before residential, after, to some extent it depends. We've signed LOIs with a bunch of companies, and that's being worked on separately. I think it's very likely that either the shipyard or the foundry will break ground at the same time or before the residential does, and so there's going to be jobs there ready. Partially because it takes a lot less time to build a factory that employs 500 workers than it takes to build 500 homes, as you know and as you can imagine. For the mixed-use component of it, the beginning, I think, is very simple. It's an initial neighborhood that will have between 500 and 2,000 homes. And then I think very importantly for us, we've recognized since the beginning that if you're trying to convince people to live in a walkable community that right now is not attached to an existing walkable city, you need to provide amenities on day one. And so to us, that means that it's going to be a few hundred homes, a couple of thousand homes. But in the middle of that is very likely a retail street where we have to kind of subsidize a couple of coffee shops and a couple of restaurants and a small general store, so that there's something to walk to and you get that initial sense of community and amenities. We then also have to build the associated infrastructure. And so we are not connecting to any of the existing system. I mean, we're connecting into power, but we're not connecting into water or wastewater. We have our own water supply and we're building our own wastewater treatment system. And so we have to build those as well concurrently with the initial stuff.
So, I mean, very similar to the capital raising campaign of you're going to have to put your money in first and wait for things to build around before you start bringing that back.
I think the question of what does the first neighborhood, or what does the first thing that we build look like, is not that different for a city of our scale as it is for many of the other new urbanist projects that have been built all over America. I mean, the main difference is we might have jobs locally because of the foundry and the shipyard. And maybe the second reason is because the eventual scale is bigger, we can afford to subsidize some of the early retail a little bit more aggressively than you can on a smaller project, because we have a longer duration to earn it back, which is part of why we've gone with a very large entitlement, because the project will require some significant infrastructure investments. And so we've communicated that, and we've told the city and we've told the local community, if you want us to be able to subsidize bringing jobs here and improving the infrastructure and subsidizing retail on day one so that you can actually build a walkable place, then we need to have more clarity on having a 40-year build out over time.
Well, and I think the mindset of building equity in a place rather than the traditional view of developers was finding a piece of land and how can I extract as much equity out of this piece of land as possible. It's a completely different mindset on the other side of you're investing in a place long term. You're going to be building there for a long time to come. So, the expectation to keep things at a very high quality, you're going to hold yourself to that above anything else. I mean, we got annexed into the city in just our small 80-acre project. It's the same question, though. It's like, at what point can the housing cover for the retail and the commercial? Because it is one of the main amenities that's going in there. And you sort of have to subsidize it early on to show people that it works and attract the next phase of residents into the neighborhood. Exactly.
And I think the comment that you said about kind of quality and commitment is very important. And I understand why. I think sometimes at the scale that we are, people have concerns about kind of the size of it. And yeah, I think sometimes the scale can be a little bit scary locally in the community. But I think what we've done over the last few years is we've been able to communicate to the community members the benefits of it. And one that I like to tell people is, if you have a developer who's coming in to build 100 homes at the edge of the city, by the time that they've built the 100 homes and they sold them, they don't care.
They're gone.
If they've promised you that the roads are going to be this or that, or they promise they're going to put flowers in the park, or they promise they're going to have a coffee shop, and it doesn't happen, or the roads start crumbling, or all of the landscaping in the park dies because it was done in a shoddy way, they don't care, they're gone.
Right.
If we've sold 5,000 homes and we've done a bad job on the schools or on the community amenities or on the retail, we are totally screwed. We haven't made our money back. We have not even made a dent in it. And we have 95% of the homes to sell. and the place now has a bad reputation because the developer did a good job. Our interest is massively aligned with the community over the long term. Same, by the way, on issues like solving transportation and traffic situation. Our interest is really aligned because we are there for the long term, and because at our scale, we are more invested in the success of that community than almost any other business.
No, I with talking with the city, I'm like, trust me, I care more about this than you that this turns out the right way, you know? So, I mean, and you guys also, though, have the other sort of boogeyman that's on your side is the Silicon Valley reputation of, I think the top FAQ on your website is like, so what kind of city are you building? Is this some sort of tech utopia?
Yeah.
Simply, and I think when you hear that, hey, there's a bunch of Silicon Valley investors that are building a new city, I think what's funny is, as you've said, it's not the futuristic city that I think a lot of people would imagine in their minds. It's actually a very traditional setting that a lot of people are comfortable with and would find as ideal.
I understand the kind of initial reaction that people have, and of course the press feeds that narrative. And maybe if a bunch of Silicon Valley billionaires go together and they decided to build a city, then it would look like what you described. But that's not what happened, right? What happened is I wanted to build a city and I had a vision for it. And then I thought, well, who can we get to fund this? Who's willing to take on something that is this risky and where they need to hold it for 20 or 30 years? And my conclusion after running the process is you wanted people who made money in California, and you wanted people who've invested in crazy things before that worked. You wanted people who would want to invest in it for reasons other than money. I mean, it's a for-profit making enterprise, but for most of our investors, there's a reason beyond money for investing in it. And some of them really care about urbanism, and some care about economic opportunity, and some care about manufacturing and building things in America. But again, I think to the community, and I think even broadly to kind of the broader audience in terms of YIMBYs and housing advocates, I've said over the last couple of years, would you rather this be funded by a private equity firm or a bank, or would you rather this be funded by someone who can take a 20-year view and really hold it for the long term? And I think when you put it in that context, then the equation changes. Then also locally, I mean, we've been able to show people there's value that comes from having part of the company be people who've worked in tech before, particularly with this whole manufacturing renaissance that's going on right now, driven by companies coming out of Los Angeles and coming out of Silicon Valley. If you want to bring jobs here, and particularly these new manufacturing jobs that are probably going to be around for 20 or 30 years, there's a lot of benefit in being able to tap into the network. And I think we've been able to deliver on that.
Well, you sort of brought up before that competition between cities. And I think that's how cities used to get built. Ford built out Detroit and really invested a ton into the downtown. Whoever was the capitalist of the local capitalist invested in the cities. And there was this sense of local pride almost of investing your money into the cities. And I think that we've completely, I mean, what the story of the last, half century has been disinvestment from cities and people sprawling out and certain zip codes across the country becoming super wealthy and everyone investing, privately, but not investing in public. And I think it's great to see that sort of investment into the American frontier again of like, hey, we can all still build something great here.
100%. And I think in California, I actually think that's one of the root causes of some of the conflict, where there's basically this bad interaction that happened where, because we've made land use so regulated, people who during the heyday of Chicago or New York might have gone in and built a concert hall or a museum or a university or built these civic institutions basically on a philanthropic basis. If you try to do that in California today, you're looking at 10 years of permitting. And so they just don't do it because it looks too complicated and too uncertain. And so as a result of it, you don't see these great fortunes recycled into the local community the way that they have been historically. I mean, you walk through downtown Chicago and it's basically a history of the industry in Chicago, right? If you look at the names on the buildings and who's funded what. And because we've made it so difficult to do that in California, you see these great fortunes invested instead in solving poverty in Africa. And I think that's important, but I think maybe we've gone too far and we need to make it easier for California money to be reinvested in California, and for New York money to be reinvested in New York, and for the version of that in every state in the country. And I think that it's kind of an interesting, unexpected negative consequence of overregulation, in that you make it harder to undertake these passion projects that people who've made a fortune might do, where they say, okay, I'm going to build a new school, or I'm going to build a new wing of a university or make a concert hall or a museum or something.
Well, and I think it's one of those things that the average person can discount what's happening in some third world country, but their lived experience on the street is like, we have homeless people, and housing prices are crazy, and it's like, who's thinking about us and who's investing here? Because there's real issues that need to be solved at a local level.
Yeah, exactly. And we had an interesting experience with that, where when the project came out in the media, some of the media liked to attack the billionaire backing, and I said, you can't do that. You guys just spent 10 years talking about why don't the tech billionaires and tech companies stop investing in stupid messaging apps, and they instead take these fortunes that have been created and invest them in real companies building real stuff for ordinary Americans that people need, like housing. And then we did exactly what people have been calling on the industry to do. And then that got attacked as well. And so I think we need to decide as a society what we want. But if we want these fortunes to be invested in stuff like building real things in our communities, then we need to make it easier to do that. And when people do it, we need to say, great idea doing that, instead of attack them.
Okay, so I know that we're coming to the end of our time here. Just a few quick sort of rapid fire questions for you. First is we didn't get to this, but the rapid permit process, which I think is key to what you're trying to do. So it really sounds like it could solve a lot of the issues of the regulatory and getting permits out on time. But can you actually explain how that would work? And is there examples of this happening other places?
Yeah, I mean, we are recognizing the complexity of land use in California. What we're basically doing is we're doing a large master plan where we do all of the different layers of it in a single entitlement package, which then creates a ministerial framework within it. Meaning we're doing a general plan change, a specific plan, a development agreement, and then even a vesting map for a very large portion of the proposed new city, and the environmental work on all of that. And they would all get approved as one package, which means if someone is coming to build, and then the entitlements themselves are relatively flexible within that, which means if some company has just raised $500 million in Silicon Valley to build drones, and they need a place to build a 500,000 square foot facility, they can come, and as long as what they are building is within the envelope of the maximum amount of space that we've permitted, they can get a building permit in 60 days. And it applies similarly to housing, where we are permitting a certain number of units upfront with a relatively broad range of densities and permitted designs and so on. And so if a home builder comes in and wants to build, whether it's someone who wants to build 5 row homes, it's a small builder, or whether it's a large scale builder who wants to build a couple of blocks, again, they should be able to get the permits very quickly. And I think that's a way of recognizing that California's land use permitting is complex, and doing it a lot of it up front, and then making it easier for everyone who comes after us. And that's part of the value that we are bringing to the project. And
key to just getting it off the ground, because it needs to accelerate quickly and get going. So, Jan, I want to close with this, because I'm totally enthralled with what you're doing. It's a hyper complex project full of coordination and no shortage of opposition. Not to mention just, of course, the weight that $1 billion worth of investment, can add to an individual. So just curious as to the why this project, what keeps you going and pushing and passionate about this California forever?
I think 2 components to it. The first one is having lived in really, really walkable places for a decade and then living in places that are not that, I'm more convinced than ever that high quality urban environments have a massive impact on quality of life for all of us. I think so many of the issues that we deal with in America today, whether it's the loneliness epidemic, whether it's healthcare and kind of generally health situation, whether it's kind of relationships and the polarization that you see in society, I think so many of those are downstream of building great places where you have a better relationship with your neighbors and your life is easier and less stressful, and your kids have more agency in their life and they don't depend on you to drive them everywhere. I really think that makes a huge difference, and I want to have a role in helping to build a place that can do that better. And then I think that this combination of creativity and financial capital and intellectual capital and openness to innovation and diversity and risk-taking that's happened in the Bay Area in the last 70 years is really, really rare. I think that happened 6, 7 times in the history of the Western world. I mean, Florence, Paris, London, New York, Chicago, that's kind of it. And so I think the idea that we are strangling that ecosystem by not building enough factories or housing or offices is just profoundly sad. And I think we need to do something about it. And when I put it all together, we have 3 young kids now, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 6-month-old. And we are going to move into the first house in the new city. It's the only part of the new city, by the way, in which I have no decision-making authority. I get to help design the entirety of the city, but however big that plot of land is going to be, I get to make 0 decisions. My wife is already deciding it in her head. But I think it would be a profoundly, deeply optimistic childhood for my kids. I mean, imagine you grow up in a city, right? And you move there and there's a few hundred people living there, and then it's a few thousand, and then it's tens of thousands, and then it's eventually 100,000 people. And you start in this small place that has a couple of coffee shops and restaurants, and eventually it becomes this bustling symbol of optimism and opportunity in California. And I think if you grow up in a place like that, where you literally see a community will an incredible place to live into existence, you can't help it but grow up to be a deeply optimistic human being. And I want that for my kids, particularly when I look at what I see around, where a lot of kids are growing up kind of disenchanted with the state of the world and pessimistic about what you can do. I think this would be a really important antidote for it, and kind of a watershed moment for the story of California. So we can play a part in that. That would be a life worth lived. And I would feel good about this when I'm looking back on it when I'm 17 years old.
Well, I have a lot to say, but that sounds like a great place to end it right there. So, Jan, thank you so much for coming on, sharing with us, and thank you for what you're doing with California Forever.
It was great to be on. I'm excited to come visit some of your projects and see what you guys are building.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. All right. Thanks everyone for listening.